and thanks for joining this online meaningful conversation. You probably know that we are running a series of online events in preparation of the international conference we will have in May in Geneva this year. And the idea is to discuss some of the topics that will be also explored during the international conference, which overarching topic is governance. And we have now the pleasure to have here with us Arthur, who will spark some ideas around the governance structures that are supporting the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And yes, this conversation is meant to be a starter for exploration, and the idea is also to be interactive. So he will start the conversations, but then we would like to open up the space for questions and a discussion that really brings in all our perspectives.
I will have a presentation to give you a little background, because some of you may know a lot about the SDGs and others may know less. So I thought it'd be useful to give a little introduction. For those who know a lot about the SDGs already, think about them from the point of view of governance. What do these mean in terms of the way we take decisions in society, either whether in government itself or in business or anywhere else? And just thinking in those terms, suddenly they open up a whole new series of perspectives. The SDGs were adopted. There was a whole 23rd Agenda of the United Nations that came out of the Rio +20 summit and was adopted at a high-level summit at the General Assembly in September of 2015. And they called this Transforming Our World 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And if you think about it, it really redefines what the purpose of government is. I mean, they show that a fundamental transformation is needed in society and the economy. Now, we haven't seen that transformation yet. The economy is still ticking along very much as usual and doing all sorts of the wrong things. The Sustainable Development Goals, which are part of this action plan, define a paradigm shift for the people and the planet. And again, you know, people are talking about it, but it's very slow in coming. In fact, I was just at a meeting last week in the Palais National here, where the head of the UN in Geneva said, we're off to a very slow start with the Sustainable Development Goals. So even 2 or 3 years in, we're still not really taking off. They should be inclusive and people-centered, leaving no one behind. In a spirit of solidarity, cooperation, mutual accountability, the participation of governments and all stakeholders. It's supposed to be a very open process, but are governments open to listening to everybody else in society and including them in these processes? If they sort of summarize what the agenda is about, it's about people, and they say, and this is, of course, heads of government speaking, we're determined to end poverty and hunger in all their forms and dimensions and ensure that all human beings can fulfill their potential in dignity and equality and in a healthy environment. They talk about protecting the planet, the environmental dimension, from degradation, including sustainable consumption and production, then managing natural resources, taking action on climate change, supporting the needs of present and future generations. They say we should be creating a prosperity that for people's lives, fulfilling lives, in which economic, social, economic progress occur in harmony with nature. But also, the whole idea of the agenda was to opening up to a much wider set of partnerships and between all the other stakeholders in society around the world, and particularly paying attention to the poorest and most vulnerable, who often are migrating, and are we welcoming them, that we're slamming our doors. These are universal goals and targets which involve the entire world, developed and developing countries alike. They are integrated and indivisible and balance the 3 dimensions of sustainable development. And this point of integration is important because I don't think we have many systems of governments today that are really good at integrating. We're very good at specializing. We're very good at dividing up responsibilities in little bits and pieces. We're not at all good at putting it all together into an overall framework. And so when we look at what are we learning about governance, we have to experiment with new kinds of governments that can integrate at all these different levels. And the heads of the top state said, it is we the peoples embarking on this road to 2030. Our journey will involve governments as well as parliaments, the UN system and other international institutions, local authorities or local government, indigenous peoples, civil society, business in the private sector, scientific, academic communities, and all people. It is an agenda of the people, by the people, and for the people. But when it comes to doing it, we're still far from knowing very well how to do it, which is the kind of questions we can be exploring at this conference we're having, with EBBF. There are 17 goals, which cover almost everything you can imagine in terms of what we need for development. And we don't have time to go into the details, but I think we should be saying, what kind of governments will allow us to implement all of these goals? Do we really have everything in place? Do we have the structures necessary to take decisions, to set policy, and to move forward in these areas? But we really should be looking at using indicators, measuring what are we really doing? Do we have indicators to capture those who are left behind, those who are, the people who are not citizens, the people who are excluded, the poor who are not part of the economy? Where are they in our tools for measurement? Or how do we design systems of governments that can be better informed in order to respond to their needs? And it includes a number of targets that are directly relevant to what we mean by good governance: promoting the rule of law and to ensure equal access to justice for all, reducing corruption and bribery, developing effective, accountable, transparent institutions, ensuring responsive, inclusive, participatory, representative decision-making, ensuring public access to information, protecting fundamental freedoms, and promoting and enforcing non-discriminatory laws and policies for sustainable development. Targets that we need to be achieving to define what good governance is. And the institutions of government should be responding to these requirements. They'll be measured, and we'll be measuring where we're going on these as we go ahead towards 2030. Part of that means having transparent access to information. If you're going to be responsible at a level, you need to know what's happening. So information has to be shared up and down the government's chain. We need consultative processes for setting principles and priorities and reviewing progress. We need stakeholder participation in monitoring and management so that everybody has a sense of ownership and responsibility for carrying out these wonderful goals that have been adopted by our governments, the United Nations. But this also means challenges for governments as it exists today. The true integrated approach means breaking down silos. We have ministries and departments, whether they be within the businesses or in governments, each doing their own thing, often not talking to each other. So how do we build integrated approaches and get the parts of government talking to each other as they move forward towards these goals? We also recognize that the purpose of governance itself has been redefined by these principles. These are the things governance should be doing for us to achieve each of these goals. Of course, also, these are very ambitious goals. They're wonderfully optimistic, even if everybody is informed. What do we do with all those people who are greedy, corrupt, violent, and selfish and couldn't care less about these goals? That's where we get into this whole problem of elite power taking over the world for their own interests and undermining system of governments in general. Just to conclude with a couple of thoughts from the Baha'i community on this issue. The transformation required to shift towards sustainable consumption and production will entail no less than an organic change in the structure of society itself, so to truly reflect fully the interdependence of the entire social body. Business as usual, or the same kinds of governance or businesses that we've had in the past. We have to be looking at an organic change in the whole way the system is working, as well as recognizing interconnectedness with the natural world that sustains us. So the links with the environment and sustainability, are part of that process. And then the pathway to sustainability, this is the element of hope that we have to keep before us in a world that can be very discouraging if you read the news every day. The pathway to sustainability will be one of empowerment, collaboration, and continual processes of questioning, learning, and action in all regions of the world. It will be shaped by the experiences of women, men, children, the rich, the poor, the governors, and the governed, as each one is enabled to play their rightful role in the construction of a new society. As the sweeping tides of consumerism, unfettered consumption, extreme poverty, and marginalization recede, they will reveal the human capacities for justice, reciprocity, and happiness. And I think when you think about governance at any level, this should be kind of our guiding. We don't know how to do it yet. It's going to be very complicated. We're learning as we go along. We have to be experimenting with new models of governments, new ideas, whether it be in our business or our workplace, in our local communities, nationally or internationally. But we should be learning how do we address governance in this new, larger framework, which the SDGs give us a very good blueprint for as we go ahead. So just to conclude this first bit of the presentation, we need to see this 2030 agenda and the settlement of the goals, that they're motivated by justice, to leave no one behind. That's really, the clarion call of the SDGs, leaving no one behind. They set positive goals, and that can be very motivating. We need motivation in the world of today. And be working for something like eliminating poverty, improving our cities, reducing inequality, that can be very motivating. And so we can take these as really positive things to work for. They also redefine, as I mentioned, the purpose of governance itself. Governments should be doing this. And they call for models of governance that are inclusive, innovating and learning, knowledge-driven, multi-level, defending the common interests of all of us. And if we can do this, building our unity of purpose can build unity in the whole community, in society, and in our businesses.
The word justice has been used a lot as an underlying concept. How can we find a common justice? Because some people feel they're acting very justly, but they're actually not really applying a global justice. Instead, they're doing a subjective individual justice, a me-first justice.
The first step in that process has to be the acceptance of the oneness of humanity. That in a sense, justice should apply to every single human being in the world. Many of the problems with justice is that we look for justice only for our racial group, or only for our country versus other countries, or only for our business against all the competitors out there, and so on. And I think it's the much narrower conceptions of the scope of the idea of justice that lead to many of the things that have gone wrong. That's not us. Justice doesn't apply to them. They created their mess. They can solve their own mess. And so I think many of the problems of injustice are because we define the scope of the term too narrowly, and therefore, in a sense, we create an injustice by excluding human beings from the concept of justice. Like in America, where in terms of slavery, they had democracy for the whites, but the blacks were property to be used. They weren't even included in the concept of justice enshrined in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and things like that. And so I think that's probably the root of many of the injustices, is because they are narrowed to something less than all of humanity, which is why we have to start with that sense that we're all human beings, and that most of the things that motivate us, and the whole SDGs and the 2030 agenda, leaving no one behind, that is justice for every single human being.
I think the slavery issue, which you mentioned, which in one sense seems to be in the past, in another sense we know that today there are more slaves today than ever before in history. And I think two of the people who are marginally impoverished, working 2 or 3 jobs, trying to make their ends meet. In a sense, we've got them not quite slaves, but they're slaves after trying to get enough money to feed and clothe and house themselves and their families. So that's a different type of slavery. And then
it makes lots of sense. Of course, when you see these things going in many directions, it's partly because that's what integration is all about. We say, how do we pull this all back together? And you talk about, you might be excluded or the disenfranchised. One of the things we've seen in the last few decades with the neoliberal economic system is the increasing concentration of power and wealth in fewer and fewer people. So in that sense, the circle of those who sort of see justice, it's a very narrow group at the top. Everybody else is increasingly excluded and more or less subject to various kinds of injustice, by exclusion, or being trapped in a working system they can't get out of, and all these other things that are happening in societies around the world. The 2030 Agenda was at least an opportunity to stand back and say, what do we do to need to correct all of these things going wrong in the world? And they've given us a wonderful viewpoint. The problem is that much of the world is still going in the opposite direction. And so how do we turn it around? And how do we use this positive blueprint to try to struggle against these negative things that are happening?
This is Laurent Mesbayev. As you indicated, the SDGs are wonderfully ambitious.
Obviously, governments always move too slowly. This takes time. There's a lot of inertia in governance, but clearly, things are happening. And if you go to the reports that have been both submitted already in the previous years and the reports that have been prepared now for submission in July, a lot is happening.
Again, I'm fascinated by the influence it's having on companies, on corporations. So whilst in the recent past, CSR was the way forward, being responsible, there was now the SDGs are really given a framework, a much stricter, much closer, much more interesting framework. And that's where companies like to live. They like to live in a situation where they can measure against each other how much more am I contributing or less in each one of these 17 SDGs. And so this is really the focus of all the CSR is now moving in that kind of direction. So that's great news. And it's creating like a positive competition. So how much are you influencing on SDGs? I'm doing more, you're doing less. And I wonder if you have any ideas on the competition versus collaboration concept, if competition can be positive in looking and striving for a bigger impact on SDGs.
I can't say that all of business has suddenly turned around to implement the SDGs. On the other hand, you have many of the B Corps and the others who take their social responsibility seriously and are happy to have a framework to work with. I'm afraid that for most of what I've seen in business today, they've more seen the SDGs as business opportunities. I think there's a spectrum, across the spectrum. There's some very good examples, and then you have the next generation of entrepreneurs, the ISECers of today, who take these quite seriously and are saying, how can they build careers around implementing this wonderful agenda? And so I think there's some hope there in terms of what is emerging for the future.
There were two concepts that I've run into in my own work in the past years that I thought kind of interact with what we're talking about. One of them called co-opetition. And in co-opetition, what happens is companies in the same sector tend to maintain better overall relationships because there are times in which they're cooperating and times in which they're competing. And they do that because it depends as the market or the opportunities shift. They have to move in and out of cooperation and competition, and therefore they can't burn the bridges behind them because they never know when they're going to have to work with somebody that they haven't worked with for a while. The other term that I think relates very close to sustainability is, and we called it continuity plans. And so, if you go to a private sector, very competitive organization, and you say, what is your sustainability plan? They tend to pull back because it gives them the feeling of, why do you think we're simply not going to survive? It seems like a reaction to threatened failure. But continuity takes a whole nother approach, where a continuity plan talks, it's not just a strategic plan, it's the ability for an organization to continue forward, which means it has to have renewable human resources. It has to have a management plan for when the heads leave or retire. It tends to cut back on that tendency of fear that many C-level individuals have as they try to clear the bushes under them and avoid a coup. And so a continuity plan really focuses on how do we keep this going and smooth, so even though somebody leaves, we may still be able to keep their intelligence with the company, or they may cooperatively work as they fade out. I just wanted to throw those out, continuity planning and co-opetition, to see how that interacts with what's going on in the conversation.
On the first point of co-opetition, businesses often like to cooperate to fix prices and squeeze you out of the market and do all sorts of things that are not really very healthy and sort of against competition. So what kind of cooperation? I mean, there may be cases of which there's a possibility that one company is big enough to take on, and they need to get together in order to respond to something that's really very large scale, big construction project that's beyond the means of any one company. One can imagine a certain number of areas where the cooperation would make sense. On the continuity planning, I don't know if you ever read Eric Beinhocker's book, The Origin of Wealth, because he's an economist who took a systems perspective. He took a systems perspective of business, and he sort of said, what were the biggest corporations at the beginning of the 20th century? It's like Westinghouse and General Electric. Where is Westinghouse today? And he showed that most corporations, in fact, do disappear if they get so focused on the short term, profiting from what they're doing well now, that they forget that everything is changing, that nothing stays the same, and they're not looking far enough down the line to develop, say, new product lines or new kinds of business for the emerging issues that are coming. But there's a longer term perspective of continuity, or what you might say sustainability, that requires a whole different way of looking at your place in the economy. And how can you ensure the sustainability of the company, even if it means changing your whole product lines and the ways of doing business, because the world is changing and the new opportunities are emerging and old ones are going to vanish, and you need to keep up. Manufacturers of slide rules, for instance, or other things that suddenly vanished as they were replaced by new technologies. Any organization that part of their governance should also be allowing enough innovation and creativity and experimenting to be always moving along with the world as it's going ahead, and not suddenly focusing too much on the present, where suddenly find the present has become the past and they were left behind. How do we move forward? Will there be companies with brilliant enough governance that they can imagine a new kind of future, which profit is no longer the end of the aim of the company, but simply one measure of efficiency among others, and that they should have social goals that would allow them to respond? How do we design an economic system that says we must create employment for every single human being? If they're not employed, how are they going to earn a salary, take part in society, and so on? We have to rethink employment in other than manufacturing consumer goods for consumers who already have too much. There's a fundamental rethinking that's needed at all levels. And those, I think, that's what the SDGs, they lay out for us, really the different elements of where we should be going in broad terms. This is what we see as a sustainable society, just and equitable. That's what we're aiming at. How do we rethink every institution? This is this fundamental transformation that the BIC called for, the quotes that I shared at the end of my presentation, that we're looking at organic change in everything in society. And so we have to be thinking about governance for change today. We're learning with the experimenting. We don't know very well how to do this yet. But the challenges for governance at all levels, whether it be in business or whatever, is how do we redesign ourselves, rethink ourselves within this new framework, this more ethical and spiritual framework, and then how do we take those as the design principles for designing something new, take place of what we know is, at the end, is probably going to collapse, and hopefully not too violently, but we have to think, what do we put in its place?
Yes, it's the case of the what's produced and what's consumed is that normally production follows the needs, and people dictate their needs and producers provide it. But we are now in a situation, especially to where the producers dictate the needs and the consumers consume it. Unfortunately, given that education has been the only productive solution to that, and that over 50% of the world, the access or cost to education is prohibitive, whether because they're the wrong gender, or they're too poor, or they're working so hard they have no time. And so, getting at poverty is really going to have to be resolving the education gap in the midst of poverty.
The problem of lack of access to science and information and education, and the problem with the consumer society today. Research has gone into improving marketing and selling better and getting people to buy things they don't need. We aren't giving equal time, equal investment to educating to live simple lives and consume less, because it's not in the interest of business to stop people from consuming and buying their products. The system itself is fundamentally flawed. An ideal in terms of a sustainable society is somebody who's content with little and freed from all inordinate desires and meets his needs and not that exceedeth them, as Baha'u'llah has put it. What does this mean in terms of the drivers of the economic system? What does it mean? How do we design creating wealth that responds to those needs and fits in that kind of a society?
This is James Jennings. It strikes me that certainly from a business point of view, one of the key issues we have is what I'll call the fetishization of ownership. That somehow or other we think of owners as this unique and privileged class of stakeholder that triumphs over everything else simply because of ownership. Of a particular, and I'll be clear, a particular kind of ownership. And so one of the things I find interesting is this question that says, if you wanted to redesign a different kind of system, you'd need to think about ownership differently. And there's a lot of examples of employee-owned companies that perform better, and they don't have a lot of the dysfunction of shareholder-owned companies, not only because the people doing the work are part of it, but you also don't have the separation where owners really don't know or care what the work is or who the customers are. So I think there's some opportunity, and there's probably some good examples of people who have ownership vested in the people doing the work.
Well, I think if you go back to the roots of the economic thinking, Adam Smith, he talked about the invisible hand of self-interest, but he also wrote papers about morality. And I think the idea to him, the limited liability corporation, you could invest in it but not be responsible for what it was doing, would have shocked him. He would have found it totally unacceptable that you did not have a moral responsibility along with that element of ownership. And I think we picked half of his thinking and abandoned the other half because it didn't support, the idea of the neoliberal system as it's functioning today. So I think this issue of ownership is one that is going to an extreme more and more, and it's distorting things. When you look at some of the Baha'i principles, where Abdu'l-Baha talks about, the owner of the company, sharing the profits with the workers, that the workers should have an interest in the company, and so you might say a certain sense of ownership in the company, that they should have shares in the company. That's the another sense that ownership should be widely spread. Everybody should feel a responsibility, and the idea of private ownership for profit, which is the result of this system of which all the benefits are going to capital. I mean, if you look at the increase in wealth in the last 20 years, most of it has gone to the owners of capital, and almost nothing has been shared with workers whose salaries have declined or remained stable over the last 20 or 30 years. So, the system has been captured more and more by the ownership side of things, and the rest of it has been abandoned.
That's the problem. Where do you see examples of where people have been able to address that in a meaningful way?
Well, I think there's a lot of experimentation going on with alternative forms of business, whether it be in B Corps or sustainable enterprises and so on. People are experimenting, and so I think a lot is happening around the fringes, and it's very encouraging because we have to be experimenting. We have to be developing new and alternative models, taking things ahead. We don't need to create corporations for whom the only purpose is profit for the shareholders. I think we've got flaws in the internal structure. We have to change the structure in which businesses are functioning, the legal framework, and what leaders are held responsible for. Now, it's hard to change what already exists. They're defending their interests against SDGs and everything else. But But my hope is that we will, see increasing, growth around the edges and alternative models developing and proving themselves, at least at a small scale. There's nothing sustainable about where things are going now. Everybody seems to say we seem to be we're heading towards a wall and we're accelerating. So at some point, something has to break. The projections I've seen, between 200 and 500 million, displaced persons, refugees in the next few decades, from sea level rise, and it's accelerating. James Hansen published a paper 3 or 4 years ago in a scientific journal. The headline was "Goodbye Miami," and he showed the half of Florida that would be left in 2100 with 1 meter of sea level rise. Now they're talking about 2 to 3 meters of sea level rise in this century, and not stopping there. Where we're going with governance, I think we should, how do we plan alternative systems of governance for wealth-creating activities, for economic activity in society that are not part of the present paradigm and could be part of a future, more constructive paradigm on which we can build the next economy after this one goes through some very difficult times. I think we could, if we look at the SDGs, they're really calling for a radical change in governance at all levels. That's the implication. If we really want to make them work, it's going to take other kinds of governance at different levels in institutions of society in order to make the SDGs work. But because our heads of state have accepted them, they've given us levers to push for change. They agreed to this. They may not have understood the implications, they've agreed to it. And so I think we should say, these open lots of doors, let's use them at all our different levels of action, whether it be within our companies or businesses, in our communities, or with governments or whatever, and then come back in May and continue the discussion at the May event for EBBF in Geneva.